Hello everyone, today I'm going to be doing a Rob Lucci deck profile. As we all know, black is one of the fairest colors right now in One Piece, needing cards for every step of its removal process. Cards to decrease cost, cards to retire units, and then even more cards to profit off of retiring units. As a leader, Rob Lucci is preferable because Rob Lucci lets us get a restanding finisher on an opponent's units. The downside to this is that discarding 2 units as cost makes it very hard to use multiple times in a game. However, the finishing options usually do make it worth it. The leader this deck competes with the most is Smoker. Smoker punishes our opponent for playing 1-drops, and will often make good players not play 1-drops at all. The issue with Smoker really lies in a lack of finisher options. Black has a limited number of finishers, making it kind of awkward in some spaces to really finish out games. Sakazuki is just a power-crept option that isn't really needed with all the major retiring effects in the game right now. Isho is crazy, but a bit weak, especially with that 4 life requirement. Perhaps with a Trafalgar Law package, you can get some actual crazy value off of the green engine. And Monkey D. Luffy is a niche gimmick build that does struggle in a lot of key areas. So of course, taking all this into account, Rob Lucci really just is the best leader. Now let's get into our deck list. We start out with 4 of our Searcher Brand New. Brand New is one of the worst searchers in the game. Not only is he a 2 cost, he only goes 2 deep, and he can't even search this deck's boss monster, Kuzan. While the trashing of 2 cards can be useful in the future, right now all it is a negative, really hurting the deck's options. Now, getting into the first wave of cards, we have our retiring options. 3 Kobe, 4 Kobe, 4 Monkey D. Garp, and 3 Sakazuki. Each one of these retire a very specific set of cards. Kobe is simple removal for those early 3 or lower drops. And a most common example, let's say you're playing against green and they drop Okiku, you respond with a Kobe and immediately clear the threat. Kobe is not as useful as some of the other removal, since it is limited to 3 or less, and he still costs a card to discard. Even still, you want to run him at 3 to keep the option open. 4-drop Kobe is a bit more controversial to use. What he does is he rests himself to KO one of your opponent's characters with a cost of 2 or less. Since this Kobe is reusable, he's way more important to the overall game plan. Not only that, once your opponent rests, it becomes a pseudo-blocker, forcing an opponent to swing into Kobe. Because, once combined with Kuzan, you end up with a better Sakazuki retire that will keep coming if an opponent can't get rid of it. And a much less controversial take is 5-drop Monkey D. Garp. He's both a 6k body, and he can keep KOing one of our opponent's units of 4 or less. Really, you do need Monkey D. Garp in this deck, as it lets you always have some sort of retiring. While we can trigger Rob Lucci's effect off of an opponent's blocker, we do want to have other options to keep threats up. And this is also a body, unlike our Kobe's over here. Sakazuki is our main retiring option. Crazy, he's how we get rid of the higher cost units. With Kuzan, we can retire a 9-drop. With Big Kuzan, we can even retire a Big Mom if we needed to. There are a few things you can change about my build to suit preferences. Going up to 4 Sakazuki, and maybe cutting something else you don't really like in here, might be a good option if you think you might have some trouble seeing him. I personally don't think that, but you might. It all depends on player preference. Now for our cost decreasing and other miscellaneous engine pieces, we start out with Kuzan. This deck is very Kuzan dependent. It's one of the main problems with my build. There's not a lot of ways to decrease cost outside of him, unless we're getting into our finishers. But for the one card we do have as the main engine, Kuzan is very solid and gets you just about everything you can ask for, except for guard value. You play him, you draw a card, and you keep attacking. A bit of a skill trick with this deck is knowing when not to attack with Kuzan to keep the threat of his -4 alive. It's not like a common thing, but it does come up a lot, especially with how variable One Piece games can be. Now for our top end, I'm running 3 Isho, 1 Kuzan. This is incorrect, as you should only run 2 Isho, and you should run 2 Kuzan, but unfortunately I could not find a second Kuzan before recording this video. But that's fine, because this build has been very solid and effective in tournaments so far, even if Isho isn't as optimal as you'd want him to be. Isho lets us just slam down on opponents for being slightly ahead. Ripping 2 cards from an opponent's hand at random is absurd. Expect Isho to come up against matchups like red and yellow more than other engines. This of course makes him kind of inconsistent, and since he is technically searchable with Brand New, you're only really going to want to run 2. He really just is awkward to use. The -3 cost to all your opponent's stuff does come up, especially in this build where we only have Kuzan as a main way to decrease cost. It's just awkward sometimes. Of course, the big boss monster from the deck, Kuzan. Kuzan slaps down with a major retiring option, combos with all the other setup we do, and he sets us far ahead for the rest of the game. Like Kuzan plus Kobe, this gets rid of a 7-drop every turn. It's crazy. He is very high cost and doesn't offer guard value, so it can be a bit awkward, but he is the main boss monster for a reason. If only he was searchable off of brand new. Now, for the selection of blockers. I am running 4 Borsellino, 4 Sabo, and 4 Bartolomeo. Borsellino is of course pretty solid in this list. Not being able to be KO'd by effects means Borsellino is always hard to deal with, as our opponent's going to have to just hard swing into him. Plus, being a technical 4 for 6 as a blocker is really good. However, he is just outclassed by our next blocker, Sabo. Sabo is both a blocker, he protects the entire board for a turn, and he offers something this deck sorely needs, which is hand fixing. Drawing 2, discarding 2 is so insanely important. As you've probably noticed, this deck doesn't have as much card value as you really want. Kuzan, Isho, Sakazuki, Monkey D. Garp all don't have guard value, almost as if a way to balance out the crazy blockers this deck has. But Sabo lets us somewhat counteract this to get what we need into hand. And lastly, speaking of counter value, we have Bartolomeo. Bartolomeo is simply a blocker, and he gives plus 2k counter. For a 3k blocker, we do have some options. If we wanted to be a bit more sacky, we could run Vivi. Vivi, however, is really only useful in Big Yellow Big Mom, where you do it as a gimmick, and should really not be thought too highly of. The better option to run is Fukurio, as he cannot be KO'd by card effects. However, as anyone who plays Black will know, sometimes you really just don't want to pay 3 for a blocker, or you need to do something early game where you can't commit units to the board. Bartolomeo having 2 guard value is just so much more useful in these situations. Lastly, for the worst option for a blocker, we could play Shirahoshi. It's just a -4 to units, and it doesn't even have stats, so it's literally never worth playing. Now to our other 2k counter and defensive options. For Khalifa, for Toshigi, 2 Monkey D. Garp, and 2 Shockwave. Now, like in every deck that runs 2k counters for the sake of having 2k counters, these are optional cards that really don't do too much. If you're having to throw down a Toshigi and actually resolve the effect, something's gone wrong. It can potentially come up, so we run 4 of this, but it's not as good as we'd really want it to be. Khalifa is a much better effect to use, but still really not what you want. Having another hand fixer, that's a draw 2, discard 2, does come up, as does the -4. Oh, sorry, as does the -2, because this card is fair and balanced. It's just there for the 2k counter value, so don't look too much into trying to find ways to use that -2 effect. Same thing with Monkey D. Garp. It's a 2k, it's also Navy, so we can potentially get it off Borsellino. It's okay. I recently cut Shockwave down to 2, and I decided to put in more guard value that we don't have to leave life up for, since this deck is already so highly costed on Dawn. Shockwave is the best event card in Black. It's got a lot going for it. It's a plus 4k, and then it retires one of our opponent's active characters that costs 3 or less. Now, on the surface, you'd think it's just as good as Punk Gibson, but there are some issues with it. Cost of 3 or less versus a cost of 4 matters dramatically. Not only that, it has to be an active character. So Shockwave is really limited in terms of what decks it hurts. While yes, it will obliterate Zoro, other decks can just play around it. Even decks that have 3 drops they want to run, like Parasparrow and Big Mom, will just swing with the Parasparrow first, making this card really just not too good in this meta. As Zoro is picking up some steam in tournament results, it's not the best idea to cut it out completely, but it should be noted how rough this can be into a lot of matchups. Now, here are some options I decided to cut from my list. The first and foremost is Meteor Volcano. Since I'm running Kobe instead, I have the gap for low-cost removal filled up completely. Kobe also functions as a pseudo-blocker, so the Meteor Volcano is just not needed, even if it is pretty popular in some other decks. Now, as a supplement to Kuzan, you could also run Sengoku. I feel with Sengoku, is that he's not needed. Dropping a 4-drop on curve is much better than dropping a 5-drop on curve, and you have the bigger issue of what do you cut? You can't really go any lower on blockers, nor top-end finishers, so you'd have to cut one of our other retiring options for it. It's not bad, it's just outclassed. Now, Black also has 2 additional options for a top end outside of Kuzan and Isho. You have 9-drop Shanks and 5-drop Smoker. Shanks is a very simple one to discuss, as he just lets us KO all opponents' characters with a cost of 1 or less. This is good in 2 situations. One, if you're playing against Zoro, and some niche situations against other red decks. Second, it's very good once you already have an insane setup, such as multiple Kuzans, Ishos, and other stuff. Shanks isn't very good. Shanks is a win more top-end card for a deck that needs help getting to the winning position, especially in a format where every deck is just better than this. Smoker is a normal monster statted body that can gain double attack if there's a 0-cost card on the field. Plus he can't be KO'd by effects, so he's pretty good. The problem, as you'll probably guess, is that within this deck, there isn't a lot of cost decreasing. So Smoker ends up being much better as a boss monster in the actual Smoker leader deck. A bigger issue is he has no guard value, so you end up not really being able to use him in a lot of cases, and he just becomes raw Lucci discard fodder. Alright, that's it for my deck profile. Thank you everyone for watching. I'll have some more One Piece deck profiles on the way as I get more experience with some of the newer decks this format. Perhaps we'll go into another Kinemon deck profile, as well as a Rebecca deck profile. But we shall see. Thanks everyone for watching, and I'll see you next time.